Minister, eminent service and serving officers on the dais, this gathering of experts, stalwarts, and most important, the true dignitaries of the evening, the children who lit the lamp. And when I say the true dignitaries, I do not mean this only as an affectation or as a sentimental fact, because if we are not discussing their future, then we are discussing nothing at all. Already, the speakers before have given you a glimpse and more of the complexities of the issue that we face. Chief Minister was right. Security itself of the oceans has many dimensions. One of the dimensions which I hope we will be able to protect, given what I am seeing in the hall, is saving the oceans from plastic, for example. It's an extremely, you see parts of the ocean spaces and shorelines, and it is terrifying what is happening. Phrases and words have been used already, which I hope that you will see the dimensions of. One very familiar reference has been made to a deep-seated belief of our Indian philosophy, which is that the whole world is a family. It actually sounds much better than it is. Alas, families are not free from conflict. The first family, according to the Bible, was in the Genesis, and Cain killed Abel. Mahabharata is a family conflict. In Islam, the Shia-Sunni conflict arises from being partially of one family. So the family itself, while obviously an image or a metaphor for a larger good, is not complete without its inconsistencies and without its problems, which is why we are, I suppose, meeting here. When we use the word security, we have to understand the collateral. Security for whom? There was an age not too long ago when the only definition of security was security for elites, for ruling classes. Wars were fought between them, by them, for them. Well, the majority of the people were bystanders. They accepted the victor and got on with life, or more often, alas, got on with the consequences of war, which is death. The first consequence of war is death. The second consequence of war is refugees. But the world has changed extremely significantly. Today, security no longer means the security of elites. Today, security means security of the people, of the masses. And if we do not get that dimension, we will not be either addressing the problem or indeed knowing precisely what to do with it. We are here in Goa. I just use a few random facts in order to try and build the pattern. Goa is also the first colony. Ceuta was actually the first Portuguese colony on the top of Africa, the northern tip of Africa, and in the Asian space. Goa was the first colony. And Goa was chosen as the first colony not because of its importance in the land systems or in the land geographies of the world. It was selected by the Portuguese, and I think strategically very rightly so, because of its importance as a hub of maritime control. So we have to take another look at many things. When you look at the map of India, you're almost automatically trapped in the land map of India. Ask anyone, from child to anyone of any age, and the map of India that comes about is this inverted triangle, which is the landmass of our country. But if you are discussing strategy and if you are discussing security, you have to look at something much more than the land map of India. In fact, I would suggest that the land map of India is far more secure than the sea map of India. The land map of India at the north, large parts of the north, has the Himalayas as a bulwark. Whatever problems we might have there, they remain a very important one. But the sea map of India, in fact, is much bigger than the land map of India. The land map of India will indicate the size of India. The sea map of India will indicate the reach of India. And the reach of India is from the Gulf right up to the Malacca Straits. I hope it doesn't come as a shock to you to know that the Andamans are less than 100 kilometers from Aceh in Indonesia. And that is precisely what our strategic space is. I see a lot of admirals there nodding because this is the space that they have had to manage and beyond. So when we try and understand themes and words which look familiar, we have to begin to take another look at the strategic dictionary. And remember one thing, that all through recorded and unrecorded, the earliest records of history were through poetry, were through sagas, through the Iliad, through Mahabharata, through Ramayana. These are also great records, and these records have actually remained imperishable in the memory of man precisely because they had their roots in something very, very significant, epochal events. But you get to understand one thing when you take even a cursory look at them, that the meaning of peace, the meaning of Shanti has not changed ever since the first consciousness arose in the human being. What changes continuously is the meaning of war. War is the thing that begins to define and redefine itself into many manifestations. And each time the challenge, literally before every 2 or 3 generations, the challenge before every 2 or 3 generations is to understand the latest manifestation of the problems or even the evil of conflict and the evil of war. And I break, and I impart no secrets when I say that we are seeing conflict in perhaps its most evil dimensions at this moment. And this is what we have for. I'm a little surprised, and I don't know how much consciousness there, that the last great terrorist attack in our country, in Mumbai, was a sea attack. They came from the sea. And we have not fully actually built it into our consciousness, what the implications and what the consequences of that whole episode were, the whole episode were, and are and will be. So it is in the pursuit. I actually began my preparations for this conference by seeing a whole list of statistics and facts, including things like we have 7,500 kilometers of a border, of a sea border, and 1,200 islands. And then I quickly realized that everybody sitting in this room knew all that. So I better move on to things and areas where we can excite the ideas and the imagination a little bit into not just thinking but rethinking. So let me begin our attempt to understand our challenge today by asking a simple question. When did the 20th century begin? It's a very important question because you cannot understand the 21st century unless you understand the answer to this question, at least in my view. The commonly understood by historians is that the 20th century begins with the First World War. 1914 to 1919. And I suggest to you that this is true, but it is not true because of 1914, it is true because of 1919. Every birth has a backstory. Every birth has a pregnancy narrative. Every birth has a womb narrative. Things happen. And these are consequences. But the emergence of something new and the consequences thereof is what happened after World War I. Briefly, in the 100 years preceding World War I, through a various set of sequences and consequences, ending up in this apocalypse of World War I, something unprecedented happened. Unprecedented in historical terms. Every single empire in the world which had controlled the geopolitics of the last 1,000 years collapsed. You take a look at wherever, east, west, center, Japanese didn't have too much of an empire, but they too had one. The Japanese, Chinese, Indian, Persian, Ottoman, Tsarist, Austro-Hungarian. You can go up to the Spain, you can go up to the Portuguese, everywhere. Every single empire in the last 150 years began to collapse. And actually World War I saw the collapse of 4 major wars. What happens when there is collapse? Something has to fill the vacuum. The importance of 1919 is that for the first time, humanity actually began to create political spaces, not around the dynasty. We must be one of the few people who still cling on to dynasty in a democracy. But it wasn't around dynasties. It was around the will of people. Now that too had its share of problem because you have to determine the will of the people. And the will of the people sometimes can be an amoeba, splitting all the time. Right now we are seeing that in Spain. However, as a principle, this was truly, dramatically unprecedented. That political space would now be decided by demos, by demography, and not by princes, kings, and there's various options. And therefore, this vacuum began to be filled with the idea of a nation state. And inherent to the idea of a nation state are 2 facts. One, sovereignty. And therefore we began in hesitant steps. I'm not saying it all came about as a sweep. In hesitant steps, we began to create a nation state, a sovereign state. And this sovereign state means that today, essentially, there are no big countries and no small countries. Everyone is a sovereign nation. Every country is a sovereign country. What we do have to recognize reality is different capacities. Everyone certainly doesn't have the same capacity. But these capacities now have to be hinged into or calibrated into the rights and indeed the obligations of sovereignty. And this is one of the continuing problems that is. The second, boundaries. Boundaries previously, and actually even up to the Second World War, boundaries were an extension of the military capabilities of ruling elites. And legally so. Conquest was not illegal. In fact, conquest first became marginally, I would say marginally, because soon after there was more conquest, marginally illegal in 1928 with an act created by the US Congress actually, which nobody remembers. But it was all legal. This was replaced by boundaries formed, fences formed around demography, spaces built upon a contiguous nationalisms or nationalities, whatever you like to say. But why else was 1919 important? It was important because that same year, at the end of the war, began the challenge to the post-empire status of the world, which was colonialism. 1919 saw the rise of the challenge. Before 1919, everybody, I'm taking the reference of India, everybody thought, I mean the wisest Indians thought, that the British Empire would last for 400 years. Then one man in a dhoti turned up, and it couldn't last for 40 years. But why couldn't it last for 40 years? Personalities are very important. In history, we know that. But personalities by themselves come and go. Personalities have to be backed by a tremendously powerful idea. Commitment, an idea that can become an ideology. And the miracle of Gandhi was not, in my view, that he merely led the first great mass movement, democratic mass movement of the people. The miracle of Gandhi lay in the fact that he used an Indian idea in order to challenge and then destroy European colonialism. Before that, people wondered, how could you defeat the British or anyone else for that matter? How could you defeat the Dutch in Indonesia or the Portuguese in Goa? I'm delighted to say that Norway was the only nation which didn't interfere in our affairs. Thank you. But it was the Indian idea called satyagraha. And satyagraha is not simply non-violence, it is the power of truth. And amazingly, somebody who articulated something as philosophical, not conventionally understandable to the mind, turned it into an idea. Just to digress a little, I've always wondered why Gandhiji made the salt march such an important fact of the last push. The last push began with the salt march. Because both in 1919 and in 1930, he was challenging the idea of loyalty. You know, salary comes from the same root as salt. Salary and salt. And you were purchased by salary. And in our language also, namak khaya. So there are deep resonances which travel. And but in 1919, he said, in order to defeat the British, you have to first stop serving them. Didn't happen suddenly. The point is again that India was created not by the strength of an alternative army, not by a guerrilla movement, not by a military force. Although Indians had military forces, each prince of India had its army. It was defeated by a mass movement inspired by a mass reality and motivated by the people, and therefore India legitimately became the first genuinely people's republic of the modern era. And this too is an important fact. The meaning of these changes actually begins to define the priorities as well as the compulsions of a nation state. So you see the rise of a nation state in the name of popular, basically a people's nationalism, around the idea of India, that you have to now be loyal to India, not to a ruling class, not to a Sahib, not to a local dynasty. His movement was no less against the princes of India, by the way. And that you have to actually represent the power of the people. The consequences of the rise of the nation state find immediately in his own lifetime a very interesting parallel reality. That somebody tries to create a nation state in the name of Islam. And exactly in order to deflect the unity of the people. Obviously this is found extremely useful by our masters, colonial masters, and it's a story by itself. I won't go delve into it. But what I will do, that 70 years after the creation of the first Islamic state in the modern era, 70 years, we can come to one conclusion, that stability is this principal factor of a people's revolution, peaceful revolution. And instability is the principal characteristic of a state driven in the name of a particular faith. And therefore, what we have seen as a same time frame and evolving, the rise of what I call the jelly state. What is a jelly state? Jelly is something that will never be stable. On the other hand, unlike butter, it will not melt and disappear either. If it melted and disappeared, maybe the problem would go, but it won't. It will remain. And jelly will become more and more toxic. And when you add nuclear weapons to it, then the toxicity becomes truly, potentially horrendous. And one of the real conflicts that we are facing today now is the conflict between those who believe in faith equality as a principle, as a governing constitutional principle. And I'm happy to say, I think almost everyone here in this room would belong to that, irrespective of whatever political system they may have. And those who believe in faith supremacy. In faith supremacy as the ruling aspect of their constitutional behavior. And therefore, others must be second class. You see this in Iraq, you're seeing this everywhere, wherever. You're seeing this in the treatment of Christians there, treatment of, we know the facts yourself. Moving fast forward, when was the 21st century born? And this, I think, there should be common agreement that the 21st century in that sense was born with 9/11. And already with this attack, you can see that the nature of conflict has now shifted very sharply. I will not dwell too much on what I would call the backstory or the womb narrative. Obviously, you can link it back to Afghanistan, 1979, and so on and so forth. But by the coming of age of terrorism as the principal element, the principal threat to security, you can see that 9/11 already represents a totally new kind of warfare. What is the warfare? Warfare is not based on using battle as a means to defeat the enemy. 9/11 didn't defeat America. 100 terrorist attacks everywhere have not defeated any nation. What it aims at, and this is therefore a much more complex thing, what it aims is not simply defeat right now, what it aims at is destabilization. That if I can achieve destabilization, then the purpose of that military assault is achieved. And how do I achieve that destabilization? Not simply by the horror of the fact itself, but by leaving and seeding every mind with fear. And fear becomes the most important weapon in this. Now, is it true, therefore, that terrorism or terrorists are only seeking chaos for the sake of chaos? We have seen phases, I think in the 1960s, those of us who are unfortunately old enough to remember, that would include the Chief Minister, I think. Remember the 1960s as an age when terrorism was used as chaos for the sake of chaos. It had no larger objective. And therefore it could be contained, solved, managed. It took its share, it took its price. But eventually we got on. Europe was actually the epicenter of that. But it is not Europe alone. I studied in a college, 67-70, Presidency College, Calcutta, with the canteen. Everyday occurrence, therefore, canteen, the total leadership of the Maoist movement, the Naxalite movement was sitting there in my canteen. And they had to go through, Bengal had to go through a very, very difficult difficult time. No, but it's not chaos. There are very serious political objectives. Number one, the contemporary terrorists, why does our Prime Minister call them an existential threat? Because they represent a threat to two of the basic fundamental realities of the modern era. One, we all know that the stability, even such as it is, but the stability of the modern era has been built around the nation state as the critical building block. You remove the nation state, the rights and wrongs of what happened 70 years ago, we can all look into it, but the larger fact remains that the nation state has now been rightly and widely accepted as an enterprise essentially of stability. They challenge it because they do not believe in nations. They believe in religion-based space, and therefore Islamic space or some other space. In a sense, you're really going back, which supersedes the national realities. And therefore you're really going back to the Holy Roman Empire in that sense. You're really going back to ideas that lost their validity in the course of history a long while ago, but have resurrected very sharply. But the more important thing for me is that basically also they are challenging pluralism. They are challenging the harmony that nations and societies have created over the history of long and many multiple experiences, and come to the conclusions that citizens and human beings can live as equals with their individual freedoms and rights, being interfered with as human beings without demanding individual or paranoid supremacy. This effort, and this has consequences, as all of you who come from Europe know, it has electoral consequences. And indeed, those consequences are part of the objective. But interestingly, the 21st century, precisely because it is a century which is controlled by popular will, whose politics is largely controlled by popular will, the 21st century is also becoming the century in which the demand of freedom, not only political freedom, but freedom of thought, freedom of action, freedom of voice, freedom from hunger, freedom of aspiration, freedom to hope, to believe. Indeed, if television has to be believed, then freedom not only to talk sense, but freedom to talk nonsense. These are part of this whole culture of freedom, which are now increasingly becoming a dominant and important and inviolable reality. Because this is a century which belongs not to ruling elites, not to dynasts, but to the people. And along with that freedom comes the economic aspirations. So this is a century which is going to demand economic aspiration as a prevalent, central reality of evolution in the immediate future. And those countries which do not enter the prosperity map of the world will find themselves in terrible straits. So we have, therefore, the challenges and I think this was briefly hinted at previously, man, according to old Charles Darwin, the old man with the long beard, according to him, he actually emerged out of the sea. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but let's assume for the purposes of this evening he was right, that we are essentially at some past stage sea creatures, but we became land creatures and then we became totally land-centric. We have become totally land-centric. We look at everything in terms of land. Our industry is land-based, our agriculture is land-based, broadly, we are 80-90% land, despite the fact that probably 60% of inside us is also water. And despite that, the moon affects us because of the water inside. And but land is getting exhausted. Even the water on land is getting visibly exhausted. It's happening in front of us. So when land gets exhausted, when green has become brown, what option will mankind have except to look at the blue? And therefore, the conflict area, when the challenge for prosperity comes, will become more and more sea-centric. And I offer you the thought that the challenge of this century will be the S4 challenge. Seas, skies, space, security. This is the 4S. And the answer to this 4S problem is in S5, which is the idea of SAGAR, which is that you can actually use these realities to create harmony rather than conflict. But for that, you need a mindset and an effort. Therefore, as I keep saying, that what we need is a doctrine. Now, why do we need doctrines for this? Because all the 5 S's, including the solution, have one thing which is you may want serious to think about over this conference. All these spaces, all these areas don't have boundaries. Sea doesn't have boundaries. Skies do not have boundaries. Space, cyberspace, does not have boundaries. Security no longer has boundaries. And with great difficulty, we managed to find stability with the help of boundaries. Now we will have to go through the most difficult task of finding stability and finding rational answers to existence in space, in areas without boundaries. And the world needs to find as quickly as possible doctrine that will actually meet this overwhelming challenge. The experience of UNCLOS and simmering this has aroused doesn't necessarily augur well, but if it is going to be something for survival, then we'll simply have to get on and get going in the process. And I'm sure with so much wisdom assembled in this hall, this will be an important contribution to the search for the future. I began by saying that if this conference is not about the smallest kid, one who actually lit 2 candles instead of 1, which also speaks of her aspirations. If conference is not about her and her future and what the world she will see 60 years later, then this conference is really about nothing at all. But I'm sure it will be of her, and thank you all for being here. Thank you from our ministry, thank you from our country, thank you from Goa's perspective. He's already looking at multiple conferences ahead into the future. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much, Norway, for being a partner. Thank you.